The road into the Appalachians narrowed until the trees leaned so close they seemed to whisper across the hood of the car. Even in late summer, fog clung to the valleys like a held breath, cold enough to raise gooseflesh. The locals said the chill had always been there, long before weather learned how to behave, long before maps pretended this place was empty. They warned that nothing brought into these mountains ever finished what it started. They spoke softly of her, never by name at first, only as a feeling like stepping into a stream fed by snowmelt and realizing too late that the cold is deeper than skin. Animals miscarried here. Women dreamed of infants made of frost. Men woke with numb hands shaped as if they had been holding something small and lifeless. Doctors blamed isolation. Priests blamed silence. The mountains listened and offered neither denial nor comfort. Deep in a hollow where the sun arrived late and left early, the ground stayed cold year-round. Moss grew pale, almost colorless, and the soil resisted being turned, stiff as if frozen from within. Old stories claimed a woman had been placed beneath that earth when the town was young and desperate, when stillbirths came one after another and prayers stopped working. They said she was chosen because she had already lost 3 children, because grief had hollowed her into something useful. They said she was buried to hold the ending shut. Those who wandered too close felt it, a pressure in the abdomen, a tightening in the chest, as though their own bodies were being asked to remember something unfinished. At night, the wind carried a sound not quite crying, not quite breathing, and the cold crept inward, settling where warmth should have been. In the Appalachians, life could begin, but here, in the mother's keeping, completion was a privilege the mountains no longer granted. The landslide came after 3 days of rain that never fell hard enough to feel dangerous, only persistent, soaking the mountains until the ground forgot what it meant to be solid. A section of the ridge above Coldwater Hollow finally gave way just before dawn, sliding down in a slow, grinding sigh that sounded more tired than violent. When the mist cleared, it revealed something no one remembered ever being there, a stone wall embedded into the hillside, its surface smooth and dark as if it had been protected from weather by the mountain itself. There were no roads leading to it on any map, no mention in county records, no stories passed down clearly enough to explain why a church cellar would exist without a church. The structure sat half swallowed by earth, its arched doorway sealed with mortar so old it looked grown rather than laid, veins of pale mineral running through it like bone. Carved into the stone were symbols worn almost flat, shapes that didn't resemble crosses or scripture, but something more circular, more inward, suggesting containment rather than worship. The air around the opening felt colder than the rain-soaked morning should have allowed, and those who stood near it noticed their breath fogging as if autumn had arrived early just for that place. County workers sent to assess the damage refused to go inside once the entrance was pried open. They reported a smell not of rot, but of iron and cold earth, and a silence so complete it pressed against the ears. One man said the temperature dropped the moment the seal broke, another said he felt dizzy, like his body was slowly being emptied of warmth. They backed away, leaving the doorway gaping and dark, a mouth that had not expected to be opened again. News traveled fast through the surrounding towns, not with excitement but with unease. Older residents grew quiet when they saw photographs, their eyes lingering on the stonework as if recognizing a face they had hoped never to see again. Some claimed the cellar was never meant to be found, that it had been hidden when the hollow was still new and fear outweighed faith. Others insisted it wasn't hidden at all, only waiting, patient in the way mountains are patient, knowing time eventually loosens every secret. By the time officials arrived with historians and surveyors, frost had formed along the inside of the doorway despite the summer heat, and the ground around the cellar felt unnaturally firm underfoot, as if something beneath was still holding itself together, resisting release, holding on to its purpose, holding on to what had been placed there before memory learned how to forget, before anyone dared to ask what kind of prayer required a place like this, or what had been sealed inside to make sure nothing ever finished being born. Once the cellar was exposed, the whispers began almost immediately, slipping through the towns like smoke under a door. No one announced the old belief outright, it surfaced in fragments, in half-finished sentences spoken at kitchen tables and in pauses that lingered too long at the ends of prayers. The elders remembered being told never to dig too deep in certain parts of the mountains, never to disturb ground that stayed cold even in August. They had been warned that something unfinished had been given a guardian, and that the guardian had not been allowed the mercy of death. According to the belief, the woman was not executed, not sacrificed in the dramatic sense people preferred to imagine, but chosen through a grim logic born of desperation. The hollow had once been plagued by births that ended in silence. Babies carried the full term only to emerge pale and breathless, their bodies already cooling in their mother's arms. Midwives could find no cause, and ministers could offer no explanation that comforted anyone. When fear began to outweigh grief, the community turned inward, searching for a solution that would satisfy both God and the mountain. They believed life itself had become stuck, unable to cross some invisible threshold, and that it needed a vessel to hold it in place. The woman, already marked by loss, was said to have been offered as a kind of living seal, buried beneath the earth where the cold was strongest. She was lowered into a chamber with enough air to last a while, enough food to make the act feel less like murder and more like necessity. The intention was never for her to survive, but for her to linger, to remain between breath and silence long enough to bind whatever force was interrupting birth. As long as she remained there, the belief went, the unfinished would stay unfinished, trapped with her. The mountain would be appeased, and the hollow could continue without drawing attention to itself. Children were born again after that, or so the story claimed, but never without consequence. They cried late, grew slowly, or carried an unnatural chill in their skin that never quite faded. The price had been paid, but it had not erased the debt. Those who spoke of the belief now did so with the careful tone reserved for truths that were never written down. They insisted the woman was never meant to be found, because discovery would mean her purpose had failed. If the seal was broken, the thing she was holding back would no longer need her, and the mountain would no longer keep its end of the bargain. What returned, they warned, would not be alive in any way people recognized, but it would remember every breath she took in the dark, every moment she waited for something to finally be allowed to end. The historian arrived with the confidence of someone who believed enough time could turn any horror into a footnote, armed with notebooks, gloves, and the quiet arrogance of distance. She began in county archives that smelled of dust and mildew, sifting through baptismal records and burial logs that showed a strange, repeating absence. Names of infants appeared without corresponding dates of death, while others were marked with symbols instead of words, small circles drawn in the margins where explanations should have been. It was in the private collections, kept by families who no longer lived in the hollow, that the pattern became impossible to ignore. The diaries were written by midwives, ministers' wives, and one schoolteacher, their handwriting tightening whenever they described births. They spoke of labors that progressed normally, of babies delivered whole and unmarked, only to fall silent moments after arriving. Several entries mentioned the same detail. The skin was cold, not cooling, but already cold, as if the warmth had never reached them. One woman wrote that holding the child felt like holding winter itself, and that the room seemed to lose heat while the mother screamed. What unsettled the historian most was the language used to describe these infants. They were not called dead. Words like paused, unfinished, and withheld appeared again and again, suggesting something interrupted rather than ended. In one diary, a minister's wife described placing her ear against a newborn's chest and hearing a sound like distant wind through stone, not a heartbeat but something slower, patient, waiting. The entry ended abruptly, the remaining pages torn out, as if the writer had decided some observations were too dangerous to preserve. As the historian cross-referenced dates, she noticed the disappearances clustered around certain seasons and locations, always near the coldest hollows. After the supposed burial of the woman beneath the mountain, the entries changed tone. The stillness became rarer, but never vanished. Instead, there were mentions of children who breathed late, whose first cries came hours after birth, or who survived but never thrived. One diary described a child who lived to adulthood without ever producing body heat of his own, relying on layers of clothing even in summer. The most disturbing discovery came from a bundle of loose pages hidden inside a hymn book, written in a hurried hand. The writer claimed the woman beneath the ground was still alive weeks after being sealed away, and that something inside her had grown colder with each passing day, as if life itself was being siphoned off and stored. The final line warned that the births had not been saved, only delayed, and that what arrived afterward would carry the memory of that cold, because it had been present at the moment life failed to complete itself. The carvings were not noticed at first because the trees themselves seemed ordinary, tall and weathered in the way all Appalachian forests are. their bark scarred by time and storms. It was only when people began walking the same paths repeatedly, drawn back by unease more than curiosity, that patterns emerged. On certain trunks, always facing inward toward the deeper hollows, shallow symbols had been etched into the wood. They were old enough that the bark had begun to heal around them, swelling at the edges, as if the trees were trying to close their own wounds. The symbols were simple but unsettling, circular shapes broken by short lines, sometimes doubled, sometimes carved over one another until the original form was nearly lost. They did not match any known trail markings or property signs, and they were never found near camps or hunting grounds. Each one appeared in places where something had quietly gone wrong, where a woman had returned from the woods pale and empty, or where a family had moved away without explanation shortly after expecting a child. What disturbed the historian and the locals alike was what the symbols did not accompany. There were no graves beneath these trees, no bones or blood in the soil. Dogs brought in to search found nothing, their noses confused, circling as if the scent vanished mid-step. It was as though whatever had been lost had simply been removed, not taken, not killed, but erased before it could fully exist. The ground in these spots was always cold to the touch, even in direct sunlight, the chill seeping upward as if the earth itself remembered something being pulled back inside. Elders eventually admitted the carvings were warnings, not memorials. When a pregnancy ended without a body, when a child failed to arrive but left grief behind, the mark was cut into the nearest tree to keep others away. It signaled that the mother's influence had reached that far, that the hollow beneath had extended its claim. The carvings faced inward so the mountain would see them, a way of acknowledging the debt without inviting further attention. Over time, the practice became instinct rather than tradition. People carved the symbols without fully remembering why, driven by a sense that the loss needed to be acknowledged in a language older than speech. Some marks were fresher than others, their edges sharp, the sap still faintly visible, suggesting the belief had never truly died out. Even now, hikers reported an urge to turn back when they saw those symbols, a tightening in the chest, a sudden awareness of their own bodies and the fragile warmth inside them. The absence of remains became its own kind of terror, because it suggested the pregnancies had not ended in death at all. They had been intercepted, claimed by something that did not leave evidence behind, something that took only what it needed and returned nothing, leaving behind cold ground, scarred trees, and the unshakable feeling that life had been stopped mid-sentence, held in suspension somewhere beneath the mountains where completion was neither allowed nor desired. The name surfaced slowly, spoken only after enough silence had gathered to make it feel inevitable. At first it was referred to indirectly, as if giving it a title might invite it closer, but eventually the words took shape among the whispers, the mother of the cold womb. It was not described as a spirit in the way people understood ghosts, nor as a demon with intent or hunger, but as a condition given form, a presence bound to the mountain by necessity and fear. To name her was to acknowledge that the cold had a source, and that it was not natural. Those who believed in her said she did not steal life outright. Instead, she borrowed warmth, the essential heat that allows growth to finish its work. She took it slowly, evenly, so the loss was not noticed until it was too late. That was why pregnancies could progress normally, why bodies formed whole and perfect, only to fail at the final moment. The warmth had been diverted elsewhere, siphoned away to sustain something that could not survive on its own. The mountain, they said, was not cold because of altitude or shadow, but because it was acting as a vessel, holding what she collected. Stories described her as both singular and shared, a woman buried beneath the earth and an idea layered over her like sediment. Her own womb, once capable of life, had become a chamber for containment, a place where beginnings were held and never allowed to resolve. The cold was not punishment but preservation, keeping everything in a state of waiting. Some claimed that if warmth ever returned fully to the hollow, everything she had taken would attempt to complete itself all at once. Midwives spoke of feeling her during deliveries, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with weather. Candles would gutter, breath would fog, and the laboring mother would shiver even under blankets. In those moments, they believed the mother was present, drawing what she needed to maintain the balance. To fight it was useless, heat lamps failed, fires died down, and the room seemed to reject warmth as an intrusion. The most unsettling aspect of the belief was the idea that the mother was not malicious. She was fulfilling a role imposed upon her, continuing a task begun when she was sealed away. Borrowing warmth was the only way she could remain effective, the only way to keep whatever lay unfinished from crossing into the world. People wondered whether she was aware of those she touched, whether she felt the gradual weakening of living bodies above her, or whether she existed now as a function rather than a person. As the stories spread, so did the fear that the borrowing was no longer subtle. Winters felt longer, summers less convincing, and even healthy pregnancies carried an undercurrent of dread. If the mother needed more warmth than before, it suggested the thing she was containing was growing restless, and that the cold womb beneath the Appalachians was struggling to hold its purpose together, drawing deeper from the living in a quiet, patient effort to prevent an ending that might be worse than never being born. The dreams began without warning and spread in a way that made coincidence impossible to believe. People who had never met described the same sensations with unsettling precision, waking in the dark with their hands pressed to their chests as if trying to protect something fragile inside. In the dreams, they stood in narrow spaces where the walls pressed close, stone damp with condensation, the air thin and painfully cold. Breathing felt laborious, each inhale scraping like ice against the lungs, and with every breath the cold seemed to move inward, settling deeper rather than escaping. What linked the dreams most clearly was the shared image of ice forming within the body. Dreamers spoke of frost blooming along their ribs, of a slow crystallization spreading through the chest cavity, encasing the heart without stopping it. The heart continued to beat, but sluggishly, its rhythm dragged down to something older and more deliberate. Several people described the same horrifying calm, an awareness that panic would waste what little warmth remained. In these dreams, survival depended on stillness. The dreams did not end when the dreamers woke. Many reported lingering numbness in their hands and feet, breath fogging briefly in rooms that were not cold. Some felt a dull ache behind the sternum, as though the chest had been hollowed and refilled with something denser than air. Medical examinations found nothing wrong, yet the sensation persisted, returning each night with greater clarity, as if the boundary between sleep and waking was thinning. As word spread, it became clear the dreams were selective. They favored those who had visited the exposed cellar, those who had touched the cold stone or stood too long near the hollow. A few reported dreaming of a woman they could not see clearly, only the outline of her body curled inward, her abdomen pale and rigid with frost. Others felt a presence rather than saw it, an awareness of being observed from below, as if something deep underground was learning the contours of their warmth. Elders recognized the dreams as a sign that the balance had shifted. They said the mother was no longer content to borrow heat indirectly. By allowing people to feel the cold inside themselves, she was marking them, creating conduits through which warmth could be drawn more efficiently. The shared nature of the dreams suggested coordination, not communication in words, but in sensation, teaching bodies how to hold cold without dying. The most disturbing reports came from those who dreamed together without realizing it. Two people would wake at the same hour, gasping, describing the same crack forming through the ice around their hearts, the same distant pressure building, as if something beneath the mountain was testing how much could be taken before resistance collapsed. These dreams were not warnings meant to be heeded, but rehearsals, preparing the living for a state of suspension where warmth, breath, and fear were carefully rationed, and where the cold inside them felt less like an invasion and more like an inheritance being slowly passed on. The child was born on a night when the town should have been warm, the kind of late summer evening where crickets sing themselves hoarse and windows are left open to invite in air that still carries daylight. The labor was unremarkable, the delivery swift, and when the newborn cried, the sound was thin but unmistakably alive. Nurses relaxed, the doctor noted healthy lungs, a steady pulse, all the signs that usually ended worry. It was only hours later that the unease began to settle in, quiet and persistent. The baby did not grow. Weight remained unchanged, limbs stayed the same delicate length, and the skin never warmed beyond a faint, cool softness. Yet the child did not weaken either. The heartbeat continued, slow but consistent, and breathing remained shallow but sufficient, as though the body required far less effort to sustain itself than any living thing should. Monitors recorded no decline, no improvement, only stasis, a perfect suspension that defied every medical expectation. Doctors increased feedings, adjusted formulas, and ran test after test, searching for a condition that could explain a body caught between states. Nothing fit. Metabolism appeared minimal, as if growth itself had been postponed rather than denied. The child's eyes opened and followed movement, but there was no hunger in them, no urgency, only a distant awareness. Nurses noted that the infant rarely cried, and when it did, the sound was muffled, as though filtered through something dense and cold. Word spread quickly, and with it came fear disguised as curiosity. People stood longer than necessary outside the nursery, pressing their palms against the glass. Some swore the room felt colder than the rest of the ward, that breath fogged faintly near the crib. One nurse claimed the child's skin cooled her fingers after prolonged contact, not in the way of illness, but in a gradual exchange, as if warmth was being drawn out and stored. The parents were told the child might begin to grow at any moment, that medicine had limits and patience was required. Privately, staff wondered if growth would ever resume, or if the infant was meant to remain as it was, alive without progression. The idea unsettled them more than death would have. Death followed rules. This did not. Those who knew the old stories felt a familiar dread take hold. They believed the child was proof that the mother's influence had reached beyond the hollow, that life was now being allowed to continue only in a reduced form. The baby had crossed the threshold but had not been permitted to complete the journey. It existed as a compromise, breathing without becoming, a living echo of all the unfinished births the mountain had claimed over generations. As days passed and the child remained unchanged, the town grew quieter, conversations dropping into whispers whenever the hospital was mentioned. People avoided the parents' eyes, afraid of seeing something reflected there, a recognition that their child had become part of a larger pattern. The slow heartbeat, the cool skin, the refusal to grow all suggested that the cold womb beneath the Appalachians was no longer satisfied with borrowing warmth alone, and had begun to produce its own kind of life, one that endured without developing, one that proved survival did not require completion, only the absence of an ending. As attention returned to the hollow, scientists and surveyors began measuring what the locals had always felt but never quantified. Thermometers pushed into the soil recorded readings several degrees lower than surrounding areas, a cold that persisted regardless of weather or season. Even during the peak of summer, when cicadas screamed and heat shimmered on the roads, the ground near the exposed cellar remained firm and chilled, resisting the sun as if insulated from above and fed from below. Instruments failed to explain it, their data forming a pocket of anomaly that refused to normalize. The deeper the probes went, the colder it became. Soil cores drawn from several feet down showed no signs of permafrost, no geological feature that could account for such sustained low temperatures. The earth itself seemed to hold the cold deliberately, as though it were not a passive condition but a maintained state. Surveyors reported a faint vibration through their equipment, subtle enough to be dismissed at first, but persistent, rhythmic, almost like a pulse slowed to a glacial pace. Those who knelt close to the ground felt it most clearly. The cold was not sharp or biting but enveloping, seeping upward through boots and bones, settling into joints. It carried a peculiar pressure, a sense that something beneath was pushing back, asserting its presence. One geologist remarked that it felt less like standing on Earth and more like standing on the surface of a body that was holding its breath. Rumors spread that the cold intensified at night, and instruments left in place seemed to confirm it. Readings dipped lowest in the early hours before dawn, when the mountains were quietest. At those times, the vibration became more pronounced, enough to rattle loose pebbles and send insects skittering away. Some claimed the ground sounded hollow when struck, not empty, but chambered, as if a vast space beneath was responding. The idea that something was still breathing beneath the soil took hold slowly, reinforced by stories from those who lingered too long. People described hearing a deep, distant sound, felt more than heard, a slow intake and release that matched the fluctuations in temperature. When the cold deepened, the vibration strengthened, and when it eased slightly, the ground seemed to relax, though never fully warming. Officials attempted to cordon off the area, citing safety concerns, but the measures felt inadequate against something so diffuse. The cold extended beyond fences and signs, creeping outward year by year, subtle enough to ignore until it wasn't. Gardens failed. Springs ran colder. Even animals avoided bedding down near the hollow, their instincts rejecting a place that felt wrong in ways no measurement could capture. To the locals, the data changed nothing. They had always believed the mountain was alive in its own way, and now it seemed to be proving them right. The cold was not a remnant of the past but an active process, sustained by something that had not finished its task. If the ground was breathing, it meant the mother was still at work, or that whatever she had been containing was now sharing the burden, drawing warmth from above to keep itself preserved below, waiting in the dark where the earth stayed cold because letting go would mean allowing something to finally complete itself. The ritual was discovered almost by accident, hidden in the margins of a tattered hymn book and in the back of diaries long thought mundane. It was incomplete, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand, but it described a method for ending the mother's influence, a way to release what had been trapped beneath the mountains. The instructions were both simple and terrifying: a circle of salt drawn around the cellar entrance, candles to light the passage, and the recitation of words meant to name the unfinished, to call it into the world fully or not at all. The text hinted that failure could awaken something worse than the cold itself, but left no guidance on how to survive the consequences. The first group to attempt it arrived with trembling confidence, equipped with knowledge they barely trusted and skepticism they could not shake. They drew the salt, placed the candles, and began the chant, voices low and hesitant at first, gaining volume as the circle grew taut with intention. The air in the hollow thickened immediately, and the ground beneath their feet vibrated subtly, as though something deep inside was testing the strength of the barrier they had made. Cold swept through the circle in waves, sharper than anything they had experienced outside the ritual, frosting their breath before it could even leave their mouths. When the final words were spoken, there was a pause so profound that it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came a sound not quite audible, like ice cracking slowly underwater, spreading beneath the ground and into their bones. The candles flickered violently, almost extinguished, and the salt glimmered unnaturally, as if absorbing the light around it. The hollow seemed to contract, pressing the participants inward, testing whether their bodies could withstand the tension. Something moved beneath the surface, not entirely solid, not entirely liquid, and the air filled with a presence that was at once familiar and alien. Participants reported sensations of weightlessness mixed with pressure, like being pulled toward and away from the ground simultaneously. The temperature oscillated wildly, warmth returned for fleeting moments only to be sucked away instantly, leaving frost where it had once felt possible to survive. Some said they glimpsed shapes through the candlelight, forms emerging from the cellar like water frozen mid-splash, but none could hold their gaze long enough to confirm what they had seen. The ritual, intended to release or destroy, seemed to awaken consciousness in the very thing they sought to contain. The mother's influence did not vanish, it shifted, growing more deliberate, more aware. Whatever had been trapped, what had never been allowed to finish, began responding to the intrusion, testing its new limits and asserting that the balance of life and unfinished life beneath the Appalachian soil was no longer negotiable. The truth revealed itself not in a single moment, but in fragments, small, almost imperceptible shifts in the hollow that built into something undeniable. Those who had dared the ritual, who had studied the diaries and traced the carvings, began to notice patterns they had overlooked. The cold was not merely absence, the stillness not merely emptiness. The mother of the cold womb had never been a monster in the way the stories suggested. She was a vessel, a keeper of thresholds, holding the space between what had begun and what could not be allowed to finish. Her womb had been a repository, a place where life could linger without ever crossing fully into being, and what she had contained was never hers alone to hold. In examining the cellar, the cold soil, and the frost that seemed to grow beneath summer heat, it became clear that the unfinished lives were extensions of her purpose, not deviations from it. Every infant who failed to thrive, every birth that paused, every child suspended in the slow passage of growth was linked through her presence, and through the space she had created. She did not absorb life for malice or vengeance, she held it because the mountain demanded a balance, because the world above had failed to respect certain natural boundaries. She had been chosen to enforce that boundary, not as a punishment, but as a mediator. Observers realized that the carvings on trees were not merely warnings, they were signs of her influence extending outward, teaching the living how to recognize what had been taken and what was still held. The shared dreams, the sensation of ice forming inside the chest, The slow, suspended lives of those born under her reach all were evidence that she was not solitary in her action. The hollow, the soil, the entire ecosystem around the cellar had become a network, a lattice designed to maintain the state she enforced. She had been alive in a way entirely separate from human definitions, her own body a bridge between warmth and cold, between life that could finish and life held indefinitely. The realization was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It reframed everything that had come before, the landslide exposing the cellar, the whispered warnings, the diaries, the frozen newborns. They were not aberrations, but signs of a system that functioned according to rules humans barely understood. Life had been preserved, delayed, and transformed in ways that challenged every instinct about growth, death, and continuation. And in the moments when observers felt the cold pressing up from the soil, they understood that the mother was still present, still mediating, and that the unfinished lives she held were as alive as the living, connected through her in a way that no one could interrupt without consequence, because the womb she carried had never been just hers, and the balance she maintained was not hers to abandon.